human body is made of 50 or 60% water.
Or more.
And none of it is the water in this cup. It's something different.
It can't be as merely a background carrier of the more important molecules of life. It's got to be significant. It's got to be important. And the textbook version of it simply doesn't work. It's probably wrong. And we better start all over to figure out what might be right.
Gerald Pollack, bioengineer, author, and one of the most provocative voices in water science. He studies a fourth phase of water, showing it's a fundamental architecture of life, structured by light and sound, creating a water battery, powering the body's circulatory system, encoding memory, transmitting data, and maybe even touching our consciousness.
If he's right, everybody else is wrong. Mm-hmm. That's pretty captivating, I must say.
As you know, I'm on this mission to create the healthiest home in the world.
Oh, that's extraordinary.
And this is why I'm here. We're not just talking science. We're designing the healthiest home in the world from the perspective of water.
They put cancer patients near a window facing east.
Morning sunlight.
Probably has something to do with the wavelengths that are generated just after sunrise. But if you have very little easy water, cells divide rampantly. There's some big problem in the cardiovascular system. You got to get the red blood cells to pass through the capillaries, and the capillaries are half the diameter of the red blood cell. So obviously there's something else that's going on. The infrared energy from the outside, which is building the easy water, is supplying the energy for something.
Circulation.
For circulation, yeah. And
wow.
We can put electrodes in the easy water, and we can get actual electrical current that comes out. You can use this principle inside a home. If we measure the properties of the water before and after, it changes after he imparts his energy. So the water is somehow
connected to consciousness.
It's absolutely connected, but I mean, there's lots of evidence for that.
Before we dive in, I want to share what this podcast is all about. You see, I'm on this journey to design the healthiest home in the world. That's why I sit down with brilliant minds across biology, medicine, design, and more, all with one goal in mind: a home tuned to human biology. This is where I brainstorm, where we explore what it really means to create a home that heals. If that sounds like something you care about, hit subscribe, and let's see where this goes.
We're expecting an earthquake here.
What do you? Are you talking about the earthquake that?
Yeah, about the earthquake.
The one that's going to cast this whole side of the continent into the ocean or something, or
something like that. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that real, or is that? I couldn't quite tell if it was like.
Where did you read about it?
Well, I actually hadn't read about it. It was a friend of mine who used to live out here had. The last time we came, about 7 years ago, he just warned me. He's like, I wouldn't be traveling over there. And he was so scared of it. And he was like, that whole, we're due for, that thing. He's like, I moved. And I was like, I think if it's going to happen, it probably won't be the day that I get there.
Well, it might be. It might be. There's the so-called Cascadia subduction zone, which runs north-south. And it's about 100 degrees or 100 miles or 80 miles off the coast. And it's created an earthquake every roughly 300 years. It's been 350 or 60 since the last one.
Oh, so we're overdue by 50 or 60 years.
Yeah, but we're talking about 9.1.
Oh, my goodness.
9.1.
I don't know what. So I'm not familiar with earthquakes. I'm very familiar with hurricanes, being from Florida. Can you give me an example, a little bit of context? When you say 9.1 on the Richter scale, I'm assuming, what kind of that's? I imagine that's something that could level this house, but I don't know the scale. I don't understand the context of how.
Every unit from 8 to 9 would be a factor of 10 in strength.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so a typical earthquake like 7 or so can destroy a city.
Oh, my goodness.
And this is 100 times bigger, 100 times more powerful.
Oh, yeah, because 10 and then
9.1.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
And where's that located? Is it located nearby here?
Well, just off the coast. 90 miles off the coast. Yeah, I was reassured when I when I read, there was an article in the New Yorker magazine. That's what alerted everybody in the Seattle area. Everybody made plans, the earthquake preparations. A house like this, there's not much you can do. It's an old house, it'll fall apart. But I was reassured because the tsunami that's expected, it will be 100-foot tsunami, and it will inundate everything west of Interstate 5. Now, Interstate 5, if you came from the airport, you went up Interstate 5. So if you live west of Interstate 5, you'll drown, probably. Yeah, if you're east of Interstate 5, which I am, and high up on a hill.
Which you are.
But this house is built at the top of a hill, and it'll slide down. So probably that's what will happen. And the shaking will probably last for a couple of minutes.
Oh, wow. And so normally it's only a few seconds?
Yeah, depending on the magnitude. Usually when the magnitude is higher, the duration is longer.
So what do you do in an event like that? You obviously would get out of the house. Pray. But would probably going out on the street.
If you can make it out to the street, that would be useful.
Yeah.
Crawling under a table like this is useful.
Really?
Well, because it's likely that something will collapse from up above. Also, stay away from windows because the windows will crack, break, and fly. Because the windows are under compression. So you want to stay away from windows as much as possible. If you're in bed, the latest suggestion is stay where you are and cover yourself with a pillow as much as you can. And that will act to protect you. It used to be that you're supposed to stand in the doorway because the doorways should be strong.
Okay, yep.
But, it's not so clear. Another idea is if you're near a sofa, for example, just lie down right next to the sofa, right in front of the sofa, as close as you can as possible. Because something falls, it'll fall on the sofa. If it's a big board or something, it'll go from the sofa down to the floor and miss you if you're really close to the sofa.
I imagine getting inside of a cast iron tub would be probably safe.
Without water, yeah. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I really don't know.
So how does that affect, for you personally, how does that affect your psychology or not psychology, but your mental state of living here, knowing that there's a potential imminent threat to your life and everyone's lives here? What is that like? Being in the most beautiful place in the country?
There are so many threats, So, when you get to be a bit long in the tooth, like me, there are health threats too. It's inevitable that as you grow older, you become more susceptible to various illnesses, and so that's another threat. And I simply don't think about it. It's not really worth thinking about it because it's not going to do you any good to think about it. So you might as well just forget and live your life as you can live your life. And, everybody's life ends. And so if it ends 10 years earlier or so, it's okay, And who knows, there might be a life after death. There might be past lives. There might be near-death experiences. I've met so many people who've had these experiences. Well, let me tell you. Have you seen or listened? I should say, listen to the Telepathy tapes. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't heard of the Telepathy tapes. No.
Yeah. Well, I recommend you listen. Someone told me the same. He said you should listen. It's a series of I think 10 or 12 episodes, and it has to do with kids who are autistic, and when they're extremely autistic, they can't speak, but they can think, and they think. Some of them are really gifted in their ability to think, but they can't speak. So the only communication that they have is telepathic. Now, most people say telepathic, impossible. This will convince you that it's not only possible, but true. So it turns out that after I listened to 3 or 4 episodes and was absolutely convinced, because, by the way, I think this is the #1 podcast that exists.
Okay.
It's so extremely popular. So I get a phone call or an email, I get an email many weeks after, maybe 10 weeks afterward. And this woman lives near the airport where you landed. And she said, in episode number 10, there's a guy named Noah. He's now 25 years old, and he communicates telepathically, and he's also a gifted healer. So his energies can heal. And she said to me, she's his main communicator. She can talk, but she's also telepathic. So she can interpret what he's saying telepathically. And she said, he wants to meet you. Meet me? Why would he want to meet me? So I asked. She said, well, he's interested, and I'm interested too, in water. And he has his own ideas about easy water. And I thought, well, this is really interesting because it's not so often that you get to meet a kid who's not a kid anymore, but he's telepathic. So we assembled, Kara, the local woman, and I assembled here on the sofa, and we picked him up on Zoom. He lives in Chicago. And he started talking about his idea about easy water, and she's listening, interpreting what he has to say telepathically. And she's got an iPad, and she starts drawing on the iPad, listening to what he's saying, quote, unquote. So she draws a circle, she draws an oval, she draws a line, and by the time 10 minutes goes by, she's got a very complicated drawing. She tries to explain it to me, and I couldn't understand it. And I don't know whether the lack of understanding was due to the fact that I'm not smart enough to know what this guy is thinking about all kinds of energies, or another possibility is that she's uneducated. She's gone through high school, and that's all. And she might be having difficulty interpreting what he's saying. And so the communication to me doesn't quite make sense. Anyway, that's how it all started. And since we're about to start now, I want to bring it to an end, but I'll tell you that we had him in the laboratory a couple of times, putting his energy or intention to water. And we found that if we measure the properties of the water before and after, it changes after he imparts his energy. So the water is somehow
connected to consciousness.
It's absolutely connected. But I mean, there's lots of evidence for that. But I just wanted to tell you that this particular incident, because it's interesting. There's a lot more to it, but
I'm fascinated by the direction this conversation is going. So I just want to keep on this thread because it's going right back into water, and actually it ties into a question that I was going to ask you later, but I think I'll just ask now. Okay. So this is fascinating, and it's interesting that you bring this up, like this whole consciousness discussion, and you really took me for a loop here when you tied it back to water. That's fascinating. So yes, I've also been, I think a lot of the world has been exploring consciousness in the last.
I think so. Yeah, there's more and more interest in consciousness, and more and more it's tied to water. Water's all over the place, and water is discovered on planets, even on stars, and it's got to be because of the ubiquity of water. It can't be as the textbooks describe, merely a background carrier of the more important molecules of life. It's got to be significant. It's got to be important. And we have a lot of evidence that indeed it is important. So this is a kind of recent turn for us. It's not a 180-degree turn, not a complete turn, but we've gotten interested in consciousness and how it applies to water. It's fascinating. And I organize a conference each year, pretty much each year. It's now in its 17th year, I think. And we call it the Water Conference. The official name is the Annual Conference on the Physics, Chemistry, and Biology of Water. And inevitably, I invite people who have something to say about water memory or information in water. And this is not a how should I say, a mainstream topic. Mm-hmm. However, there's so much information, so much evidence on this that it's really hard to reject this as a possibility. So
could I ask, because you're about to head into something, I want to ask the question. In your book, The Fourth Phase of Water, you write that water can absorb and contain energy, and
yes,
that some of this energy may, in fact, contain information. Therefore, water in my interpretation of what you're saying is that water is some sort of data drive. So it's some sort of memory, like it has some sort of memory, and it makes me think of the memory of water and studies that have looked into like water and memory. So my question to you is what did you mean when you said that water can contain energy and energy can contain information? What did you mean by that?
I think your question is asking what kind of evidence are we talking about, and what are the implications of that evidence? So the first, let me expand. The first major study was done by a guy named Jacques Benveniste, and Jacques was a friend, and he was a guy with guts, and he was a guy who really liked to pursue what he thought was interesting. And he was a distinguished French scientist, high level, well respected, with a laboratory of some 50 people, approximately. He was an immunologist, and the work that he had done previously appeared in textbooks. I would say he was almost a legendary guy. Well, someone came to his laboratory and presented something to him that was really astonishing, and he picked up on it. And that was, so he had an experiment where he would expose a particular solution or particular cells to antibodies. It was a very a specific kind of experiment in which particular antibodies, when exposed to these basophil cells, the cells, when exposed, would secrete histamine. So someone comes to his laboratory and says, I can take those antibodies and dilute them and dilute them and dilute them to the point where there's really no antibodies left. There's just water. If you dilute enough and get the same result. And he said, impossible, can't be. But open-minded guy. So he said, take a corner in the laboratory and demonstrate it to us. So he demonstrated to them, and he got 50 people surrounding them looking to see if the results would turn out positive. And indeed, they turned out positive. So Jacques understood the importance of these experiments and started pursuing them himself. And the results were positive, and he decided to send it in to publish into Nature. So he was working in Paris, and Nature was across the English Channel in London. And he sent the paper, and Sir John Maddox, who's the editor of Nature, took the result, looked at it, and said, this is impossible. It can't be. How can water store information? Because this was a very specific kind of reaction. And in order for the reaction to occur in what seemed like pure water, because of all these dilutions, you dilute and dilute and dilute, and, seemingly, obviously, there's nothing left but water. So the water must have had memory of those antibodies that had been in there initially. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. And Maddox said, it's impossible. How could water store information? How could it have memory? How could it have memory of antibodies or substances that had been there earlier? It's impossible. Reject. I won't even send it out to review. Jacques was, if you pardon the expression, pissed, and not a guy to be put down exactly. So he decided that what he was going to do is ask a bunch of colleagues in different countries to repeat his experiments using exactly the same protocol. And they got the same result. They decided to get together and submit the paper together as a group. It went to Sir John Maddox again. And Maddox said, I don't care how many people repeat it, it can't be true. Therefore, not going to publish it. So meanwhile, in Paris, there are a lot of homeopaths who use this very technique of serial dilution in their homeopathic remedies. And it seemed to them that Jacques Benveniste, this well-known, well-recognized scientist, was actually repeating the same kind of thing that they do and justifying that this is really something real. And the word got to London across the English Channel that there was a lot of consternation and hubbub about how Nature summarily rejected their paper without even review because they said it simply can't be, but they're doing it every day. And so they got the message, and Jacques told me when I went to visit him, when I first met him, he said, I got a phone call on that phone right there. And John Maddox, it was John Maddox, the editor of Nature, and he said, I'll make a deal with you. What's the deal? The deal is I'll publish your result next week's Nature, with little comments saying that we're going to be visiting his laboratory, observing what these French people are doing, and reporting back to you after we find out. And then we'll. So he asked Jacques whether Jacques would be in agreement with that, and he said, of course. I mean, Jacques was a genuine scientist, and he thought everything was on the up and up. And so 3 weeks later, they published the paper 1 week after, and then 4 weeks after, they appeared in Paris, the committee. It's supposed to be a committee of peers. That's what was promised. And the committee consisted of 3, quote, peers, unquote. The first peer was Sir John Maddox himself, who was not a biologist. He was a physicist. He never quite made it to his PhD. He became a reporter for Nature and worked his way up and eventually became the editor-in-chief of Nature. That was the first. The second was a guy from the National Institutes of Health. What's his name? I forget his name, but he was in a group of people at NIH in the Center for Scientific Integrity. In other words, these are people who are approached when there's a suspicion that someone is cheating. So if you're cheating at your university, for example, you're painting black spots on white rabbits in the middle of the night, and the guy in the next lab happened to be in there and noticed that you came in at 4 a.m. with a paintbrush and you're painting these little spots that you claimed appeared out of some biological experiment, but you actually painted it. So he would report to the provost of his university, and if the provost didn't take proper action, he would report to this Center for Scientific Integrity, and the people would investigate. And if they found that he was guilty, they would suspend all contributions to his research. So that was the second guy. And the third guy was the most interesting one. He's called the Amazing Randy the magician. And the Amazing Randy is the guy who could figure out the tricks of other magicians. Like there was a guy, an Israeli guy who said that he can levitate, and this guy Randy figured out the trick.
So he's a debunker.
The debunker,
Yeah, yeah.
right? The debunker. So that was the committee. It wasn't exactly a committee of peers. It was a committee I don't know
Prove
what-
him wrong.
Sorry,
It sounded like it was a committee to try to prove him wrong.
to prove him wrong.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So they came and the French did the experiment with this serial dilution. They got exactly the result they predicted. And then they did it again, and the committee coded various samples, and everything turned out. And then the second guy I mentioned from NIH did the dilutions himself, and it didn't turn out the way they predicted. And by the way, when they wrote the paper, they said, this does not work 100% of the time. However, it works overwhelmingly large fraction of the time. But sometimes it fails, and we don't know why it fails. Actually, they do know why it fails, because if there's someone sitting in the room who thinks that this is a trick or something like that, then they have evidence that it often fails.
Tying back to your claim with the boy who autistic telepath,
Right.
And his consciousness influencing the water,
Right,
in some way.
absolutely. But anyway, it was a debacle for Benveniste, because since it didn't work when the visitors came, they huddled in their room and they decided it's a trick. And even the world's, quote, greatest magician couldn't figure out the trick. So they reported in Nature that, the experiments were done in a sloppy way, et cetera, et cetera. And his career, Benveniste's career, went south. He became a scientific joke. And, it came around, you're having trouble with your memory? Drink some of Benveniste's water. It's got memory in it, And I know people who knew him, and he was totally demoralized and devastated. His career plummeted down to a scientific joke from an esteemed scientist, and he died early, unfortunately. So that's I mention this because he's, you might say, he's the first person who studied water memory or information water in a major way. There were many others, and let me just mention two, because there are others in between. But I want to mention first Masaru Emoto, because he was a spiritualist, but he had evidence as well. And then at the other end of the spectrum was a Nobel laureate, Luc Montagnier, who happened to be a friend of Jacques Benveniste, and took over when he passed. So Emoto, I think a lot of people know about him because he published a book about images in water, and the book became a very famous one. So anyway, he was a spiritualist, and he had evidence that if he would direct his energy to water and then freeze the water and then look at the ice crystals in the microscope, if his energy that was directed to the water was positive energy, like I love you or peace or something like this, when he looked at the crystals of the frozen water, the crystals were beautiful by any standard. If he said, I hate you, or if he played music, that was
Classical music or something.
No, classical music was beautiful. Mozart, beautiful. I saw some crystals of Mozart and Bach, but heavy metal was really ugly. Yeah. So anyway, he became ultra famous, mainly to spiritualists. Scientists didn't really take his work too seriously because he never did the kind of analysis that scientists would anticipate. However, Dean Radin, a distinguished scientist who in fact studies phenomena like this, he determined that the results were actually statistically significant. So that's Emoto, and I know those people very well. He died a decade ago, and his son has taken over, Hiro Emoto. So they're still working. And Luc Montagnier, finally, regarding water memory. His experiments were just so interesting. And, the fact that he won a Nobel Prize for identifying HIV. But he did it. And the man was an intellectual, so he wanted to do something else. So he wanted to study the memory of water because he recognized that if this is true, it's really supremely important. And so he tackled it. So he came to our conference. He came every year for 10 years until his death. And the experiment for which he's famous is an experiment in which he demonstrated that water could hold information on the DNA sequence. So what he would do is he would have a vial of DNA in an aqueous buffer and a sealed container, so nothing could get out, factory sealed. It was a short sequence, like 100 base pairs of DNA with obviously a certain sequence. That's where the information is held in the sequence. And then next to it was a container of water that was also sealed. So the two are just sitting next to each other for 24 hours. Some ambient energy was supplied, energy like 50 hertz or 60 hertz or something like that is in Europe, so it's 50 hertz. So the two are sitting next to each other, the DNA in the water or aqueous buffer and the pure water. And his hypothesis was that the information and the sequence of the DNA was being transferred to the water. So they sit for a day. He takes the DNA away. He's got the water. He pours the water into the various chemicals required for the PCR reaction, the one that's used widely for COVID, which amplifies the DNA. And new DNA comes out, and the new DNA has the same sequence as the DNA that was sitting next to the water. Isn't that beautiful?
Oh my goodness!
You can imagine. You can imagine the result of that. You can imagine the result. You can imagine the reaction to it. And he told me that it was presented. There's an annual meeting of Nobel laureates that takes place in a place called Lindau, which is in Lake Constance in Germany. It's a kind of peninsula, almost an island. And every year there's a meeting, and Luc Montagnier presented at that meeting. And there was practically laughter all the way around. This is so ridiculous as to border on impossible, or so impossible to border on ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I got reports from several people, including a guy at the University of Washington who is a Nobel laureate. And he didn't know that I knew Luc Montagnier. And he knew I was interested in water. And so we had a discussion about it. And he said, I was at Lindau and I listened to this guy, Luc Montagnier, who won a Nobel for discovering HIV. And he presented something that was the most preposterous thing I ever heard of. Complete nonsense, absolute nonsense. And I fear that was the reaction of practically everybody who was at that conference. But at our conference, people are open-minded. This is a conference on water that attracts people who are not interested so much in mainstream science, but in new science about water. So it's an exciting conference, and people are very friendly, open. You can meet and speak to anybody you like, including Luc Montagnier. A lot of people come because Nobel laureate, you can sit and have lunch with him and chat with him. And a lot of people are impressed by that. Anyway, I got to know Luc pretty well. I remember once we spent some time together in Abu Dhabi, and both invited to give talks. So I got to know Luc pretty well before then, and we were at the same hotel for 2 weeks, nicely supported by the people in the United Arab Emirates who are not poor, so they could put us at a nice hotel. So we'd go to have a meal at the restaurant. There were 4 or 5, but there was one main one. And it was a a large, noisy restaurant with terrific food, and we'd sit at the same table many, many meals. It was noisy. I couldn't hear him. He spoke very softly with a thick French accent, and he was there with his girlfriend. And finally, my inability to hear what he had to say, his pearls of wisdom, I turned to her and I say, Suzanne, please, could you interpret for me? I'm trying hard, but I can't understand what Luke is saying. She said, oh, I have to ask him to repeat 100 times a day. So
it wasn't just you.
It wasn't just me. Anyway, so that's part of the story of water memory or water information. And I would say there's a huge abundance of information in studies way beyond what I've just talked about.
Well, what it reminds me of, just to you saying that, the first thing that came to mind was that there's really two ways to go here with the water having information. First is that it's a storage bank of information of some kind, but the next question in my mind, which you just answered, was: is it just a storage bank, or is it a transmitter of information as well, or a receiver of information? Right? Because the idea is in theory you could somehow put information into the energy that is bound within the water, and then maybe that stays there. But then the experiment where they had the DNA sequence separated from the water, that wouldn't have transmitted in any way, right? Because it wasn't touching. But what you were saying earlier with the dilution, in theory, like in order for that water to maintain its memory, it would have had to have transmitted it to the fresh water that was going in, and then that water would then have propagated, I guess, the data in some capacity to the new water, and then it just keeps, recurring. Which means that water is not just a storage bank of information. It is a transmitter, receiver. It somehow is communicating with other water in some capacity. In that case, and if that's the case, then that leads me to think about some of these. I'm hesitant to say studies while sitting in front of a scientist like yourself, but I've seen. I don't know if they were formal studies, scientific studies that were done or not, but I've seen examples of plant life where they would grow plants, and then similar to the water, where once they freeze it and the crystals, if you played heavy metal music, the crystals would be they would look very chaotic versus something classical. Then the crystal form of or I should say the frozen form of the water would show something that looks very structured, like crystal form. And I've seen a very similar study where they would play classical music, or they would sing, to plants, and then those would just flourish and grow and just be abundant with life. And then others would be isolated. Other plants, these are plants we're talking about, would be isolated and exposed to heavy metal music or words of hatred, things like that, and those would die. And then I saw they took it a step further, and they're like, we're not going to do any music. We're not going to do any sound. We're just going to like think, these positive thoughts and negative thoughts, right, toward one and the other, and similar conditions occurred. And now I'm thinking, well, it almost seems like potentially the source of that is maybe the water that those plants are living from, right? That they're deriving their life from, right? It's the water, and so then that makes me think, how much more, for us, if we were to just, I'm extrapolating here, but you can kind of see the thread of thought, like why is this important that we're talking about this, right? I'm trying to bring it back to us and our health. It's like, wow, is it possible that, the human body is made of 50 or 60% water, right?
Or more.
And none of it is the water in this cup. It's something different, right? I think that's the premise of the book that you've written. It's not gas, it's not ice, it's not necessarily liquid water, it's something else. And we'll get into what that is in a moment here. But if that thing somehow carries memory, somehow transmits, receives information, somehow is tied to consciousness, well, that is, I think that's potentially one of the most foundational, discoveries or pieces of information that would underpin an entire paradigm shift of how we understand ourselves and our health. Would you?
Well, not only would I agree, but I think that what you say is foundational for science. We don't have all of what you say. I agree with, and I've seen many studies that show, for example, sound and human health, sound and health of plants. All living things seem to be responsive to sound. And many people are studying it right now. People reporting at our conference each year.
But ultimately, sound. So I just want to make one comment here. So one thing that comes to mind is that sound is just everything is on the spectrum, right? So sound is effectively just one slice of this pie of energy form, right?
Yeah.
Just like light is a higher frequency slice of the same energy form, so different sliver. At least that's my understanding of it.
Well, the energy maybe is different, but yes, another kind of energy,
right? And then
different wavelength. Yeah.
And if that's the case, it seems to me like the way that consciousness is affecting things like water, similarly to how sound or light might affect water. It almost seems to me like consciousness is potentially on that energy spectrum to some capacity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are so many studies that demonstrate what you're talking about. And I just want to make one remark about that. You know, if you think of this water here, the idea that this water can store information has seemed a little far out because the molecules are bouncing around a fierce number of times each second, and they're randomly oriented. And that's not the kind of substrate that you would think of in which information could be stored. But easy water is completely different, because easy water that we discovered has a stable shape, and it's like a crystal. And crystals can store information. If you think about, for example, if you think about a computer memory, think about the thumb drive that you stick into the port of your computer. It's a plane. One plane contains transistors, and the transistors are in a regular two-dimensional array. And each transistor has two states. We call them 0 or 1, or on or off. And it's the distribution of these zeros and ones in two dimensions that creates the memory. Now, the question is not this kind of water, but easy water. Does that have a similar structure? And it absolutely does, because the easy structure, which I'll talk about as soon as we get to it, is a series of sheets, and the sheets are stacked upon one another, and each sheet has a hexagonal motif to it. The hydrogens and the oxygens of water are displayed in the regular two-dimensional pattern, which then repeats on successive sheets. It turns out, so it's got regularity, just like the thumb drive, but it also has oxygens that have not two states, but 5 different states. The oxygen molecule, this is standard chemistry, can have 5 different states. We call the -2 state a valence, but it can have -2, -1, 0, +1, +2. So easy water, in summary, has all the characteristics that a computer memory has. And so we may not think of this kind of water as being capable of having memory. However, if the energy that comes in changes this water to easy water, and we have evidence that occurs, the easy water that's in this liquid can store information that way. And if it could store information, there ought to be a way of extracting the information, although that's not yet revealed. The bottom line is that you can, if what I've said is correct, and turns out to be practical. You can build a computer memory not out of silicon transistors, but out of easy water. And that computer will be the size of a pinhead, because we're talking about elements that are at the atomic level, not at the transistor level. So you can reduce the size. You think that the computer memory right now is pretty small, but you can reduce it by a factor of easily 1,000,000 times.
Oh my goodness. Well, that makes me think of studies on memory in the human body, and how it seems to me like the direction of our understanding on memory is that it's not entirely local to the brain. This thought that memory maybe is not local to the brain, and now talking about memory in water, I'm almost wondering if potentially the structured water or the easy water in our bodies potentially is serving some form of propagating memory.
I've been thinking the same thing as you've been thinking. If the memory lies in the water rather than in the neuron or the neural network, the capacity is so much larger. And if you think about piano playing, you play a trill, and it's impossible. You play a trill really rapidly. It's impossible for the information to come from your brain to your fingers that quickly. There must be something local. And when you think of something local, you think of water, and you think of this kind of information. It harks back to the work of Rupert Sheldrake. I'm not sure if Rupert Sheldrake, if there's one dean of alternative science, it's Rupert Sheldrake. He's a prominent guy. He's British. He studied at Cambridge University, and we're friends. He's had dinner on this table right here, and I've had dinner at his home. And I find him intimidating because he speaks with a Cambridge University accent. And, anything that comes with a Cambridge University accent, no matter what, it sounds totally brilliant. And when we chat, I speak with my Brooklyn accent. And I've been told that no matter how brilliant the ideas are that you may have, it sounds like nonsense. So here we have this Brooklyn guy talking to Cambridge University, and well, I needn't say anymore. But he has a theory. It's called morphic resonance, and he says the brain is merely a transducer. That the information is somewhere out there. He doesn't know where, but somewhere out there. It could be, there's a lot of water out there. It could be in easy water, for example. It's not his idea, but I'm just suggesting one possibility for which I have no evidence whatsoever. It's just speculation. But that the brain is essentially a transducer. It's like a TV set. The information is not in the TV set. The information is electromagnetic. And the TV set is merely a transducer that allows you to capture the information.
Well, I've heard this. I've heard briefly this theory, and one of the, I guess the logic, excuse me, the logic behind it is that the human body is made up of a ton of different transducers, like sight, smell, touch. Like these are all transducers. Light, photosynthesis, for plants or for human body for vitamin D production, things like a lot of these are not. At least that was what I heard, at least for the logic behind potentially, our consciousness and our memory, and potentially that being more of a transducer than actually a local storage of the information.
Yeah, it makes sense if you begin thinking about it. Yeah, the brain is so limited in the amount of information it can store. If you accept the usual understanding of how the brain works, it just simply doesn't have the capacity to store all the information that we've got. Nobody really understands how all this works, but it's one of those frontier areas that needs to be studied. And the fact that water can store information is is knowledge that is fundamental to figuring out how we think. I think of the brains, perhaps you've seen the evidence of people whose brains are, whose brain cavity is essentially empty. They've got like 10% of their brain and they function almost normally with 10% of their brain. There are various studies on that. It's astonishing, and it certainly provides a clue about, how information is stored and how it works in our body. So the brain may be important, but it's not perhaps all of the mechanism of information retention and understanding.
Wow, this is amazing. Okay, I'd like to take this back a little bit. Before the lab, before you were Gerald Pollack, PhD, the leading scientist currently, it seems, on easy and structured water. Before all of this, you were a child, you're growing up, you were learning about who you wanted to be, who you were. I'm curious, what sort of early obsession or maybe an accident, led you, maybe changed that trajectory toward this path that you're currently on?
Well, thank you. That's a penetrating question. I really, as a child, I think I had a normal childhood with loving parents, parents that didn't restrict me in any way. So I felt a kind of sense of freedom, not constrained. But it was my first career. So water is my second career. Now, my first career was muscle contraction, trying to figure out how muscles work at the fundamental level. And I was hugely influenced by a Japanese guy who came to work with me as a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. And I was working with muscles, with heart muscle in particular. And it was his task to take over where I left off, because I'd been 8 years. It's time enough for my PhD. And I think my advisor liked me, so he kept me on doing one thing after another. So this guy came. His name was Tatsuo Iwazumi. And he was an ultra-talented guy whose kids at age 4 began playing the violin, and they both went to Juilliard, and they both became accomplished violinists. But he was a scientist, and he told me that he couldn't take over my project because it was fundamentally wrong. I said, well, what do you mean it's fundamentally wrong? What are you talking about? He said, well, the theory that you're invoking in muscle contraction is wrong. I said, well, wait a second. This theory is a theory that's put forth by Sir Andrew Huxley, not only a Nobel laureate, but a Nobel laureate among Nobel laureates. He comes from the Huxley family. He won a Nobel Prize previously. He was master of Trinity College, Cambridge, president of the Royal Society. When he walks in, there's a hush in the room. It's like God has just walked in. That's whose theory it is. And you mean to tell me there's something wrong with his theory? Well, yeah, it's impossible. What do you mean it's impossible? He said, and this guy came from a background of a lot of engineering from the University of Tokyo, which is the #1 university in Japan, and MIT, and he'd been around, and then somehow he wound up at the University of Pennsylvania. He said, it's not stable. He said, in the first contraction, the muscle will fall apart. Oh, come on, what are you talking about? How is it possible? It's this guy's theory, and he's so important and so famous. Well, he convinced me in 5 minutes that he was correct. And since then, unfortunately, he passed recently. Since then, nobody's ever refuted his argument, which is pretty interesting. So it convinced me that, it doesn't matter if you're a Nobel laureate, you still can be wrong. Mm-hmm. And that made a big impression. So I started my career having a bit of doubt about accepted theory, and gradually it wore on to other accepted theories that we think of all the time as being correct simply because they're in the textbook. And I learned that simply because they're in the textbook doesn't mean they're right. There are a lot of things in the textbook that I have come to doubt. And anyway, we started doing experiments on muscle contraction. And we had 3 different experimental results that refuted directly Huxley's theory. I never met the guy. I mean, you don't usually come to meet God. But I decided after we had these 3 experiments, I would take a trip to London and meet the guy, you know. So I went to London, and I remember I was sitting on the park bench. I arrived 30 minutes early. I didn't want to be late. So he meets me at the door, the place at 9 o'clock, precisely the time I was supposed to arrive. And pleasant, and he escorts me up to his office, you know, not an opulent kind of place like anybody else's office, and sits me down and asks me, well, you know, please show me your results. I showed him my results, and we spent 3 hours together. He asked me numerous questions about the protocols and the specific examples of results from each of the 3 experiments. I had no idea what he really thought about it, whether he thought that these experiments really did refute his theory, or whether not, or whether he thought, yeah, they counter his idea, but he's not going to make much of it because he doesn't want to be challenged. I'm not sure, but anyway, I want to make a point about the meeting of Sir Andrew Huxley. When it was over, 3 hours later, and there was a younger student. It wasn't a student; he was actually a worker in his lab. He said not one word during the 3 hours, just sitting and listening. So Sir Andrew, who I actually came to know pretty well after a while, he turns around, opens up a cabinet, and pulls out a bottle of sherry and pours 3 glasses of sherry for us. And what I learned from that experience is that if you're an ultra-famous Nobel laureate who nobody will challenge, and nobody will challenge him, I learned that, you just simply don't challenge Sir Andrew Huxley, you know, unless you're a nutcake like me and, you know, you believe in data. Data don't fit. Sorry, it doesn't fit. You know, I wasn't brash in that way. I was very polite. But I noticed the guy's lonely. He's sitting in an ivory tower. Nobody would challenge him. Could you imagine sitting in an ivory tower and nobody will challenge you ever? Even if you're absolutely dead wrong and you say something that's completely preposterous, nobody will challenge you. It sort of reminds me a little bit about our political situation. But I learned 2 things. So I learned, first of all, that the more important you are, the more lonely you get. He taught me that. And also, I learned that if you're so esteemed as he was, he passed, I think, about 8 years ago. If you're so esteemed, there's no challenge. Nobody can effectively challenge you because everybody in the field will assume that you're right and will want to be anointed by you. It will make your career. Sir Andrew Huxley says, oh, you got good experiments. That's great. The last thing you want to do is to get into the camp of a challenger like me. And there were others, but the challengers, they all lost. And I wouldn't say we lost. We almost kind of lost. People didn't pay attention to what we produced in that.
So what were the results of that meeting then? How did it?
Well, the results were that I learned 2 things. One is, as I said, the loneliness. And 2, I came to realize how important was the fact of notoriety. You know, when you're challenged, when your nemesis is a guy who won a Nobel Prize and is a member of the famous Huxley family and is president of the Royal Society, master of Trinity College, Cambridge, there's no way that your challenge can prevail. Almost no way, because people don't want to pay attention to anything you do. They would prefer to pay attention to him because it's meaningful for their career. It's less meaningful to pay attention to stuff that we produce. But I got to tell you, I present each year. I'm invited to the University of Calgary to present, and my colleague there presents the standard story to the students. Then he invites me to present in a 1-hour lecture why they're wrong and why there's a different mechanism that prevails. And each year, he's been inviting me back for like 15 years because the students love it. And they've asked me, this is so obvious that you got the right answer. How is it possible that everybody is still thinking, now after 1955 was the time the theory, or 54, the theory came out. How could they still believe that particular theory when your evidence is so compelling? You've repeated your critical experiments 3 or 4 different ways and gotten the same result, and so many people have in your laboratory have done it. How is it possible? And I try to explain to them that, if you're important, it matters less whether you're right. You're just important and you'll prevail.
So has this always been a quality that you had, even bringing it back to your childhood? Has this always been a quality that you've had, like to seek truth above, all else, and be able to stand in opposition to the mainstame narrative?
I'd like to say yes, but I think it's not true.
No, I would love to hear.
Mine was just a normal childhood. Playing with lots of friends and being a pretty good student, not the best one, but pretty good. Normal. It was in my graduate student days and young professor days that I learned about the system. I learned about how it works. And what I learned is, that science, this field, the endeavor of science is not as pristine as we like to think. There's a lot of I hate to use the word corruption, but I guess there's a lot of corruption that goes on that has to do with personalities, that has to do with egos and stuff like that. I would tell you that in me, it instilled a sense that just because a theory is in the textbooks, just because almost everybody believes that it's correct, doesn't mean that it's correct. Mm-hmm. There are many factors that go into establishing a belief system. I just deviate one bit because I have to mention, the atom. So I have 3 books that I'm working on. One of which is finished, waiting for my son, the artist, to do it. This book is just about being published. This is a different one, and I'm happy to discuss it in a few minutes if you like. The next one is on the structure of the atom. The one after that is on volcanoes and earthquakes. And the one after that is on cell biology. That one's half done. The others are pretty much done, especially the atom book. And I wanted to mention the atom book just to make a point. The structure of the atom was the structure that we kind of believe these days was initiated by Niels Bohr in the very early 1900s. It prevails today. There are modifications that have to do with quantum mechanics, which most people believe and some people doubt. But the essential model, which you learned and I learned and everybody learned pretty much, is pretty much intact. And that is, you've got a nucleus that contains protons and neutrons and some now subatomic particles. And you've got electrons or electron clouds that circle the nucleus. So it's been around for 5 generations. We all believe that since it's been around for 5 generations, it must be correct.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You believe it's correct.
I believe it's correct.
Yeah.
Change my mind.
Okay. Well, I believe I might be able to change your mind in 5 minutes because we're talking about middle school concepts. We're not talking about complicated concepts. Okay, first point, nucleus. Nucleus consists of protons and neutrons, basically. Neutrons are neutral. We don't have to pay attention to them exactly. But protons are positive, and you squeeze a lot of positive charges together, and what do they want to do?
Repel.
Repel. So, and the repulsive force is actually much, much stronger than you think, and I can provide the evidence for that in a moment, and it's in the book. Much, much stronger, not just much stronger. Anyway, if you put all those positive charges and squeeze them together, the nucleus wants to blow up, right? So what prevents it from exploding? Well, the physicists did think about that. And they said, well, since we know the model is correct, there must be something that holds it together. And they invented a kind of glue to hold it together, which is called, quote, the strong force, which has become an essential feature of nature, a fundamental feature of nature, the strong force. This was invented, and it has just the characteristics so that it holds the nucleus together and it doesn't impact anything else. This was taken from someone's imagination. There's
Like Star Wars.
Like Star Wars. Yeah, there's no evidence for it. It's just, it must exist, you know. So if you like that, then you'll be happy retaining the model. But there's more. Now, electrons are negatively charged. And in middle school, I learned that negative charge attracts positive charge, right?
Yeah.
So you've got a positive charge nucleus, right? And around the nucleus are these electrons. And my understanding is that the two are attracting one another. So my question is, how come these electrons or electron clouds don't collapse onto the nucleus?
Yeah,
okay.
Okay. Yeah, because I would imagine that you would not. You're right. Yeah, you would not have an electron field around the nucleus because it would collapse in because negative and positives attract. Now, of course, that's my middle school understanding, of the way that physics works.
It's valid. Your middle school understanding is like everybody else's, and if plus attracts minus, there's a big problem. Even Niels Bohr, when asked about the hydrogen atom, one plus, a nucleus, one minus, and electrons are now electron clouds. He was asked, how come they don't coalesce? He said, they just don't.
They just don't.
They just don't. Now, if that's satisfactory for you, then keep the model. It's fine.
No, I don't think I am satisfied with that anymore.
So did I convince you in 3 minutes or so that there is a problem that needs to be addressed?
Yes, there's a problem.
There are many more problems that I don't need, almost as simple, that I expose in the book. And my conclusion is there's something wrong with the model, something fundamentally wrong, because it's not stable. Atoms need to be stable. This table is made of atoms stuck together. The table doesn't explode, and it doesn't collapse into a point, right? The table's there indefinitely. This one is more than 100 years old. It's been stable for a long time. So we need another model.
So are you suggesting that matter, and maybe I'm extrapolating too far here, but are you suggesting that the material world we're looking at is not necessarily built upon atoms the way that we know them? Because there's another perspective of matter, and it's more of an energetic perspective of matter, that it is I don't know enough about it to get into it, but then there's the particle understanding, like matter is a thing, that comes together, like a bunch of atoms coming together to make the table, right? And the atom is like one of the most indivisible, or I should say the protons and neutrons should be one of the most indivisible, units of matter.
Yeah.
But matter is still a thing you can touch, right? Whereas energy or frequency, that's a totally different model or way of thinking about how material things, come into be. But if you're challenging the structure of the atom, are you also potentially challenging that there are a base unit of physical, like material thing that comes together?
No, I'm not challenging that. I've heard about the energetic argument. Frankly, I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me. Maybe it's correct. Maybe it's a limitation on my part. But I think of atoms in the traditional sense that they're the building block of everything we touch and feel and see. And the textbook version of it simply doesn't work.
Got it.
So therefore, either we stick with it and we continue to build on it, and science becomes ever more complex. When you build on a foundation that's not the right foundation, everything becomes incredibly complicated. And I believe that's where we are in science today. Extremely complicated. Mother Nature, this is my own personal view, it believes in simplicity. If we have a mechanism that comes from Mother Nature that is straightforward and simple, good chance it's correct. Good chance our understanding is what Mother Nature had in mind. If we have to twist our arms and legs in order to and scratch our heads to come to an understanding, my initial take on it is it's probably wrong, and we better start all over to figure out what might be right. I understand it's a pretty radical point of view that I'm taking. I'm interested in truth. I'm in search of truth.
I can tell.
I don't like mechanisms that I really have to try hard to understand and can't understand them. And I find my colleagues don't understand them either. And we tend to believe, because they've been around for a long time, they must be correct. I don't believe that they're necessarily correct. I believe you got to start from foundational concepts and build from there. And so the atom is about as fundamental as I can get. However, the discussion that we've had about consciousness and energies and such, they play a role somewhere, and memory, water memory, they play a role. The role needs to be elucidated. And I don't know what happens after we elucidate it, because I don't know where the fundamental mechanism lies.
Well, it seems like if consciousness and other energy forms, light, sound, have an effect on information, right? And information stored in water.
Yes.
Then if that is true, then we are affecting the physical world in some capacity, even if it seems minor, at least in the studies that we're discussing now. I say minor, but I can't think, oh, that mountain will go away and then it just goes away. Like that would be a dramatic shift, right, in the effect of like my consciousness on the material world around me. But we are seeing at least that there is some sort of effect from consciousness to the physical world. And so if that's the case, then that is an effect of potentially, I mean, we're once again taking a leap here, but like that is an effect of an energy form. And we see the effect obviously of energy forms like infrared radiation with easy water, for example, sunlight, sound and cymatics, or sound on the memory of water. And then when you freeze that, the structure that it begins to show. I mean, like we're seeing energy form affecting physical form. And so it doesn't seem, I don't think we're ready to make any claims or anything, but it does seem like there's definitely a connection between the energetic to the physical. And if that's the case, then I feel like it is intersecting with the challenge that you're presenting on the physical building block being the atom, and that being the way that we end up getting to a physical reality or a product or a material like, this table here.
Could well. We just don't know, because I haven't even seen a working hypothesis for how consciousness can affect matter, or can affect water, at least.
I think that would be an incredible collaboration between your laboratory and another laboratory that's working on consciousness. That would be an incredible to generate a hypothesis and then do an experiment to see if there's some way. I know of two places that are approaching this as scientifically as possible.
Well, I know some folks too, but you have three scientists and you have three different ideas.
Sure. Sure.
Collaborations work if the collaborations are natural and if there's a complementary ability to work in complementary ways. Well, you know, it's been said that great ideas don't usually come from committees; they come from individuals. So I take your comment in a well-meaning way, but I'm not sure that the hypothesis will come out of such a collaboration. We'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're right.
Okay, so I'd like to start moving the conversation toward your current work in structured water. And I know you have a different word for it because everything has structure. You call it exclusion zone or easy water. Could you give us like a quick 2-minute summary of what exactly is this structured water? It's not liquid, it's not gas, it's not ice, it's something different. And apparently that is the form of water that is mostly in our bodies, it seems. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And the way an easy way you can think about the water in our body. Think about a raw egg. Crack open a raw egg, and examine the egg white. Now, we're told that the cytoplasm is just like liquid water, just like this. But you can see from the cytoplasm, from the egg white, that it's a gel. And that gel is essentially what we've discovered that we call easy water or fourth phase water. Another way you can determine that it's not liquid water that is inside your body or inside your gel, inside your cell. You can, if you're brave, you can take a razor blade, run it along your forearm, cut. And if you do that, what you find is that blood comes out, right? But water doesn't come out. And oddly, it would seem oddly that if the cells are filled with easy water, and if you cut the cells, the water should come pouring out as from a breached water pipe, but it doesn't do that. Even surgeons who, I've got a friend who's a surgeon, and she tells me that, deep in the abdomen, you cut through a muscle, and you'd expect that the water, which in theory is inside the cell, should come pouring out, but it doesn't. Never comes pouring out. So
I'd never thought about it that way, but
it's good to give some practical examples that could convince you. So there's something else that's inside the cell. And I first learned about this. I didn't invent the idea. I learned about it from a guy named Gilbert Ling, who passed about 5 years ago. Gilbert came from China. He was chosen after World War II in 1948. The Chinese government decided they were going to send their most promising young scholars to advance their careers in the U.S. And over a period of 2 years, they identified 4 people who they sent over, and Gilbert Ling was one of them. The other 3 won Nobel Prizes. Gilbert did not win a Nobel Prize. Many people think he should have won 2 Nobel Prizes for all the many contributions that he made. But he was a controversial guy, and the work that he was doing was controversial. I first met him at a conference in Hungary. The conference was to honor the life of a famous Hungarian biophysicist whose name was Ernst. He had two fields of interest. One was muscle contraction and the other was water. I represented muscle contraction, and I presented my ideas, and I guess it went okay. And then Gilbert Ling came and presented his ideas on water inside the cell. And I was simply blown away. He said, water inside the cell is not like water in a glass. He said, it's not liquid water, it's different. He said, He called it structured water, and I think that's where the name originated. His idea was that the molecules of water were actually stacked on one another or lined up like soldiers at attention. And you can imagine such because many people think of a water molecule as being like a dipole, like a bean with a plus at one end, minus at the other end. And so you can imagine how these beans would stack upon one another. And that was his idea. It's ordered, it's structured. It's not randomly oriented molecules bouncing around rapidly. I was astonished. He had so much evidence in favor of some kind of structure. And other people came after him who had been specifically invited, who supported his point of view, who had evidence in support. I was mesmerized. I was blown away. But, I realized I have a proclivity for getting blown away by interesting stuff. And so I had to pinch myself. And the way I pinched myself was to come back and give one of his books to some of my more promising students. Read his book. Tell me what you think about this. Because I didn't tell them, but I'm thinking this is so important that, we're maybe going to shift our interest from muscle contraction to water. They came back to me and their reactions were the same. This is so important. This is so interesting. And he has so much evidence to support his point of view presented in that book. And if he's right, everybody else is wrong. Now, that's pretty captivating, I tell you. So it was then that I decided to get into the field. I was excited, satisfied, happy with the work we were doing in muscle contraction, but I'm thinking water may be more important than muscle.
It's more foundational.
It's more foundational, right? Well put. That's what I meant. More foundational. And so we didn't have any money to study water, although, muscle is mostly water. If you line up all the molecules in the muscle, you'll find that it's 2/3 by volume. But if you line up all the molecules, because the water molecule is so small, in order to feel that 2/3, you need a lot of water molecules. So it turns out, if you do the arithmetic, it turns out that more than 99 out of 100 of the molecules in the muscle are water molecules. And, so in theory, we ought to be able to spend the money that we have to study muscle to study water. But I felt it was cheating a little bit to do that. So rather than getting immersed immediately into studying water, I wrote a book, and it's called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. And the main reason for writing the book was to present Gilbert Ling's ideas in a way that even mortals like myself could understand. His stuff, I'm not sure, maybe his personality or something, but he was thinking that everybody is just as brilliant as he is. And so he'd sit down at the word processor or the typewriter before that, bat out something, and send it to the publisher. The idea of editing was not familiar to him. I wonder whether that was part of it was missing from the Chinese language, maybe the word editing. I'm not sure. So Gilbert hated my book. I thought he would love the book, but he hated it. And he became my enemy. It took me 10 years to restore that friendship. I tried and tried and tried. And I think he felt that, or he told me that I didn't mention his name often enough in the book.
Well, it's going back to what you were saying earlier with like the politics of science a little bit. Right?
The politics of science. Yeah, we're all human, right?
Yeah.
And we have egos and such. And so I think he felt I was stealing his thunder. And I could understand that. But when finally we had evidence for long-range ordering of water, he stood up at a conference and was clapping his hands. He was so happy. And then we became friends once again. So I was pleased about that. At any rate, that's where we started. Then we managed to get a little bit of money, and we started doing experiments. So what we found, we tried, at first, it was merely an attempt to prove that Gilbert's ideas were correct, or that he was right on track, that there was such a thing as structured water. We wanted to demonstrate that. And we did. We could demonstrate in short order that there was a kind of ordering of water that occurred. I'll skip the details of the experiment because maybe they're not so interesting. But we found a region where water molecules excluded any kind of substance that was dissolved in the water or suspended in the water. So that's why we called it exclusion zone. And the other reason was exclusion zone, easy to remember.
Yeah.
And it works. And so we use that term very often. Later, we called it fourth phase water because everything about the nature of that exclusion zone differed from ordinary liquid water.
Could you list a couple, a few of those differences between easy water and liquid?
Sure.
I think we understand the difference between gas and ice, but liquid and structured water seem very similar to probably most people, and so I'm curious what your...
Well, yeah, one of them was viscosity. So easy water has a high viscosity, and higher viscosity, and that harks back to the gel-like behavior that I mentioned earlier. So high viscosity is one. Order is another. The molecules are ordered in some way, which is really what we wanted to find out, and we found out. And a third one, there are a dozen of them, but let me just focus on the third one because that's maybe the most important one. This region of water we presumed is going to be neutral because we started with neutral water, neutral liquid water. So of course it should be neutral. We made measurements of the electrical potential in that exclusion zone, and we thought it should be neutral, but turned out to be negatively charged, typically negatively charged. And that didn't make sense at all because when you start with neutral liquid water, how could you wind up with a large zone of negative charge? You know, who created that negative charge? Where did it come from? And a lot of head scratching, and we're thinking there must be another region that has positive charge, equal amount of positive charge. And we found it just beyond the EZ. So we found the EZ is created next to some surface early on in the experiments.
A hydrophilic surface.
Hydrophilic surface, right. And next to this hydrophilic surface, we found this exclusion zone of fourth phase water, negatively charged. And right next to it was positive charge, protons lodged in the water. And usually protons stick onto water molecules, forming what's called a hydronium ion. But that's of secondary importance. The important part was we got negative charge next to positive charge.
Mm-hmm. And it didn't collapse, similar to your atom critique, right?
It didn't collapse. And, you know, I might mention the reason it didn't collapse, since you asked the question, is that the structure of the EZ turned out not to be, as Gilbert Ling thought, you know, a lineup of water molecules. It turned out to have a different structure. The water underwent a change. And the change is next to this hydrophilic, water-loving surface, the water turned into layers, surfaces, one surface, then another surface, and another. And each surface is nucleated by the previous surface. It forms a template for the growth of the next one. And these layers can extend out up to 1 million of them, is typical. That would be half a millimeter or so. You could see it with your naked eye.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Now, the structure of each layer is a honeycomb structure. like many hexagonal kinds of structures appear throughout nature, and this is one of them. So you've got hexagons here, and the opening of the hexagon is very small. It's made even smaller by the fact that the next layer, also hexagons, but shifted slightly, half of the width of a hexagon. So it means the holes, the hexagonal holes to get through are very, very small. The hydronium ions that are sitting out here, the positive, although the positive would dearly love to enter into this matrix, but can't get there because the holes are too small. That's the key. That's what prevents the two from combining.
Fascinating.
That's what keeps them separated. That's what creates a battery.
Yeah, the water battery.
The water battery. And so, that's one of the main features, is that the water becomes a battery. Now, we never think of water as a battery, but water is a battery.
It's funny how and I know I'm jumping a little bit here, but we were talking earlier about consciousness of water, or I'm sorry, the potential relationship between our consciousness and the water in our body, or the easy water in our bodies. But there's like this other connection, which is like energy levels, like my ability to feel tired or feel energized physically, and potentially water's ability to when structured, to create these positive and negative zones that potentially create some sort of loop or energy, like a battery, quite literally. And I'm curious, I can't help but wonder, I'm curious if that is related to how someone might feel, chronically tired, or other people might feel more invigorated, at different times.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is energy. Of course, the question that your question leads to is this energy used by nature? Mm-hmm. Well, if easy water is filling your cells, which a bunch of evidence is suggesting that is the case, then that energy is used. And we have some evidence so far, some evidence that energy is definitely used. In the cardiovascular system, I could go into it if you want. But
maybe briefly, I know you had mentioned about how the heart potentially can't really pump all the blood through all of the vessels through our body, but there might be a different mechanism related to this. Is that where you were?
In the laboratory, we found that if we take a hydrophilic tube, like a straw, and immerse it in water, we found that flow goes through the tube. Now, we would never expect it, because usually you need a pressure gradient to shove fluid through a tube. Like your heart establishes pressure and the flow goes through the large arteries, but it doesn't. And we found the energy is coming from infrared light from outside, to make a long story short. Okay. Meanwhile, we jumped to the cardiovascular system, and it was a Russian guy who convinced me that there's some big problem in the cardiovascular system, and that is you got to get the red blood cells to pass through the capillaries, and the capillaries are, many of them, most of them, are half the diameter of the red blood cell. So, it's like you got to squeeze. It's sort of like stuffing, like your toilet gets stopped. You take a plunger and you plunge, and you need to exert a bit of energy to clear the toilet. Well, nature has to exert a bit of energy to push those red blood cells through the capillaries. And you could see them in videos. I have a video. You can see the red blood cells are squeezed this way. It takes a lot of energy. A Russian guy calculated if the left ventricle is responsible for supplying that kind of energy, the amount of pressure that would have to be developed is something like 1 million times the pressure that it actually develops. That's high blood pressure, 1 million times. So obviously there's something else that's going on. And it didn't take long for him to convince me that was the case, although I started with my nose up in the air thinking, what's he going to tell me that's interesting? But it was very interesting. So there's got to be something else. He has a half dozen different ideas. I had another idea. We saw in the laboratory, if you have a tube immersed in water, flow goes through the tube. So I'm thinking it could be that the vessels themselves, just like the tube, the vessels are actually helping to drive the flow. We found that experimentally that was the case. So this is one example where the energy, infrared energy from outside, which is building the easy water, is supplying and separating charge, is supplying the energy for something
circulation.
For circulation, yeah. And
wow.
It could
probably the majority of the circulatory system.
It could be a majority. We don't know. We haven't gotten there yet, but it's either a majority or a minority. You're probably not aware. I think a lot of people are not aware. We all think it's ATP, a high energy phosphate, and the ATP that's supplying our energy.
That was my thought. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, everybody grows up with that thought. Same with me. Until I found out that there were challenges to this point of view. And one of the challenges is by two guys who I know. I almost did a postdoctoral fellowship with one of them, and I came to realize only recently that these guys did a classical study. They challenged the idea that ATP has a high energy phosphate. They did extensive studies, and they concluded that in ATP, there's nothing special. The phosphate energy is just like any other phosphate and any other molecule. So the idea that there's something special about ATP was discounted by them. And several other people after them challenged that point of view. So we got a problem here. We don't know for sure who is right. Is the original paper by Lippincott, I think he was a Nobel laureate, 1941, is he right in that ATP is supplying all of our energy for the marathon that we run? Or is it possible that electrical energy from easy water is supplying certainly some of it, but it could be all of it? We don't know. It's so critical that these studies need to be followed up to see who's right. Is it ATP? Is it electrical energy? Is it both or what?
But either way, foundationally though, structured water seems to have some sort of foundational effect on all life, obviously, but health specifically. It seems for human bodies, for plants, it seems like if we are mostly water and water has these unique properties, then there's something to be explored here for sure. Maybe we don't know exactly all of the health benefits yet of it, but we definitely, there's information based on what you said about the circulatory system. And obviously circulatory system is a foundational system, in the body for health,
yeah.
So the fact that it would have influenced that, after reading your book on the topic of health, but also on, your current research, I guess there's just a few more questions I'd like to cover here to really understand structured water a little bit more. Now, you had mentioned that infrared radiation seems to be the wavelength that structures water, particularly infrared from the sun. I was curious if you could give me a little bit more information as to which wavelengths actually grow easy. Is it only infrared? I also believe I read that you had said that ultraviolet radiation might actually be destructive to easy water, but I'm not sure. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Okay, so infrared, we found the visible wavelength extends up to 800 nanometers approximately. That's red. And beyond that is infrared. So, it's pretty much the same as visible light. It's just that we can't see it. So it's a kind of artificial distinction. But we did find that red, the long wavelength red near 800 nanometers, has an effect on building EZ. It's just that when you get to 1,000 nanometers and particularly to 3,000 nanometers, it has a ultra powerful effect. It's really strong. We went up to 5 micrometer, 5,000 nanometers, and we experimentally couldn't extend beyond that. But infrared in the range of 800 nanometers to 5 micrometers, it's all pretty powerful, with 3 micrometers being the peak. and red. And now there are all kinds of therapies, by the way, that use red and use infrared. As far as ultraviolet, that's at the opposite end of the spectrum, the very short wavelength. We didn't find that any expansion of the EZ when exposed to ultraviolet light. However, in recent experiments just published a year ago, we found that it actually builds, it doesn't expand the EZ, but it builds charge in the existing, builds negative charge in the existing EZ.
Ultraviolet light does.
Ultraviolet, yeah.
Interesting.
So yeah, it is interesting. So in fact, at least at the wavelength that we studied, it basically builds energy. So it gives us energy. If EZ water is giving us energy, it gives us more energy.
Interesting. So it's like infrared portion of the light spectrum creates the battery, right? Or creates the EZ, and then ultraviolet, it's like trickle charging that battery or keeping the flow of energy through there.
Well, yeah, but it's not one or the other. The infrared not only builds EZ, but it also builds the charge, because without the charge, you have no EZ.
Okay, but they go together.
Yeah, the charge can be amplified by ultraviolet.
Excellent. Okay, so then you also mentioned that everything emits infrared radiation. The human body emits infrared radiation. And I remember thinking to myself, because I know that there are products out there that structure water for drinking purposes and whatnot. But the first thought that came to my mind was like, why would I need to structure water outside of my body if the moment I drink it, my body is emitting infrared and the water is being put into an environment that would automatically structure water. And I was just, I don't know anything about this. And so, but my instinct was that maybe I don't need to worry about water being structured outside of my body, because I can take regular liquid water, drink it, and then my body might be turning it into structured or easy water inside, where then it has those benefits. I'm curious if you've been presented with that question, or if you've thought about, this.
Yeah, I have thought about it. You look to me particularly healthy, which means your cells are filled with easy water, I think. And indeed, if you drink it, some of the water that you drink turns into easy water. Not all, you pee out a lot of it. Others might or might not get converted, but you want to you want to maximize any conversion. So, what I think really happens is it's not that if you drink structured water, you'd think, well, I'm drinking structured water or easy water, fourth phase water, and therefore I'm going to have a lot in my body. And I don't think that's the way it works. I think it's that you drink easy water, it's got negative charge. It's a negative charge that seeps out of the water and seeps into regions that are devoid of that negative charge. And that we found that negative charge builds easy water. So if I take this water here and I put negative charge into it, it'll turn into easy water. Interesting. Yeah. So it's hard to understand the way, if you drink easy water, how the easy water migrates into your cells. But it's easier to understand how the negative charge from the easy water that you drink migrates to wherever there's not a lot of negative charge, and thereby converts the water from ordinary liquid water into easy water.
Interesting. Okay. And then the other thought that came to mind was that it seemed as though easy water or structured water in and of itself was not necessarily, I don't want to use the word stable, but I will here because I don't have a better word for it. It seemed like it wasn't necessarily stable in and of itself. It seemed like it was very dependent on a light source, like a source of light, like the sun, to structure it. And then if that sunlight went away, then the easy starts to collapse within that same amount of water. So to think that easy water could be created and then stored, in a bottle or in the dark or whatever, like that, it didn't make sense to me like that exactly is possible. It's more of like a live creation of easy water while it is being exposed to the energy that is creating it. And then once that goes away, it starts to collapse. So it's something that if you are creating easy water, at least to drink or to expose yourself to in some capacity, you should in my mind, you should be exposed to it in front of the energy source that is creating it.
Well, yes and no. This needs to be studied. It hasn't been studied adequately, but we have some evidence that easy water can remain stable over a long period of time.
Okay.
We got, many years ago, a guy said he was creating easy water. He sent us a sample, and at that time we were testing. We don't test anymore because we just don't have the capacity. But he said it was sitting on my desk for 3 months, and we tested it after 3 months, and it contained a substantial amount of easy water. So we don't know whether the original one contained more easy water or whether the easy water is created over time. But at least to some extent, the easy water persisted. It could be that the easy is actually pretty stable. In typical experiments we do, where we take a hydrophilic surface and we create an easy in the chamber, and usually it's about half a millimeter in extent. If we just let it sit there over a period of a day or two, it'll decrease. But this is an artificial kind of situation, and the bottom line is that studies need to be done. We don't know the answer to that.
Okay. So then how long does it take to grow easy? Obviously, you're mentioning studies on how long it would take for it to collapse or degrade, and we don't know that yet. But I'm assuming you do have a pretty good idea of how long it takes to create easy. Is there a certain amount of time under a certain amount of sunlight or et cetera that it would?
Well, I mean, every condition is an infinite number of conditions, but typically in the laboratory, we set up in a chamber, and it'll take maybe 3 minutes or so to build an exclusion zone of a third of a millimeter, a little bit more to get half a millimeter, and it kind of stops. So we're talking of a few minutes.
Is there an optimal diameter size for in piping, that you found creates more easy than less? Obviously, we have the circulatory system, which is half the size of a blood cell, seemingly creating easy water. But I assume also in your experiments you've had much larger diameter piping.
Well, not much larger. No, if you take a pipe or a tube, the maximum width of the zone that builds up is typically wouldn't be larger than a millimeter. So if you have a tube that's the size of a meter or something like that, you're just going to get an annulus of growth. It won't grow beyond that. It might grow a little beyond that, but not a whole lot. There are special circumstances where the easy can grow beyond a millimeter or so. We've done it in a tube, a long tube, a meter long, like a fluorescent tube. And the exclusion zone will grow at one end to, say, a half a millimeter or something. And then it'll reduce to a kind of dendritic structure that will run the full length of the tube, a meter, sometimes even either split at the end or when it hits the end, come back. So it's what you expect of a crystal. But that's an unusual situation. A millimeter or so is typical of the maximum extent.
Quick break. We did an entire design lab in the middle of this episode. It's a working session where we go from conversation to what would we actually build. We talk through what ideas break, what assumptions change, and how would we validate it. Here's a tiny clip from the workshop.
But if the Earth is negatively charged, then just similar to how I would bond a footer, to like a foundation of a home, or bond any sort of pool equipment or metal things around a pool in order to, or you would ground, the wiring in your home. My mind went to, man, we probably should not be using.
Now, if you're part of the deep dive crowd and you want the full design lab, you can grab this bonus episode at the link below. All right, back to the interview.
Let's say you have an unlimited budget. What is one experiment that you would do right now?
being in a position of struggling for budget, I guess I would study Vortex. A lot of people talk about vortices, and they haven't been studied adequately. The assumption is made that vortices structure water. I haven't really seen any conclusive experiments. A lot of people think, well, it must be. But if I had an unlimited budget, I would put a couple of engineers to work, because if vortices do create easy water, it might be that they create them only during the period of the vortex, not afterward. It may be a transient thing. You're spinning the water, and the surface of that conical surface, the conical surface is where the EZ forms. And then it might just disappear when you stop vortexing. That's not clear. So it needs to be studied. If we had an unlimited budget, there's so many things. We're into studying cancer now. We produced a paper on it. In fact, I'm going to be in the film on cancer. The idea is everybody has been studying genetic causes of cancer. And if the answer lies somewhere else, who's going to find it? And I think it has, and there are various reasons, which I maybe don't have time to go into right now. But if you have very little easy water, cells divide rampantly. It's been demonstrated that you have low electrical potential, small electrical potential. You have a rampant cell division. And we know now that small electrical potential means not much easy water, because it's the negative charge of the easy water that builds the electrical potential in the cell. So I wrote a paper about cancer, and it seems to be attracting some attention. And I think there's a fair chance that the answer does lie in the dearth or absence of very much easy water. Love to study it. We have a little bit of money to study it, but I wouldn't say we're desperate for more money, but we can sure use a lot of money. And there are also all kinds of interesting technologies that one of them I was going to mention in terms of the architecture, and that is we can put electrodes in the easy water, one electrode in the negative, one electrode in the positive, and we can get actual electrical current that comes out. We have proof of principle. I demonstrate this on videos often and some of the talks that I give. So wouldn't it be interesting or nice if you can use this principle inside a home to generate electricity to run all your appliances? It should work. It's just a matter of scale up. It uses infrared energy as the source, which is all around us. You don't need visible light. It just needs somebody needs to tackle it.
So I do a lot of work in off-grid homes, and energy production is a big deal.
Sure.
Obviously, with needless to be said, this topic fascinates me absolutely. I would be very curious, and so there's no one researching or doing this topic that you're aware of to like scaling up this water battery.
No, it remains, and it's not under patent.
Hopefully it doesn't get patented by the wrong people.
No, I don't care, because I have no interest in making money. I would like to see this perfected and developed.
Yeah, I think that would be a really wonderful way to fund. Okay, so last question for you. What is one way that we can all introduce more structured water into our lives or into our homes? Easy, low bar.
Well, drink it is one, but you're never really assured that the people who are hawking this stuff really do have structured water. It's nice to see the evidence, and maybe some of the companies have produced evidence. I know some of the companies say, well, we tried it on plants and they do fantastically on plants, and that is a good indication that they probably do have it. I haven't invested the time myself to check on these various companies to see if they're producing actual water with structure. One of the odd things, a colleague of mine said, "Hey, when you go to the airport, you go beyond security. You have water fountains that you can use to fill your water bottle. That's after security, because obviously they don't know what you're taking through security. And there's a company that produces these, and I've seen them now in a half dozen airports. So they're all over. They call it easy water.
Oh, really?
I don't think it's really easy water, but it's really a curiosity. Maybe it is easy water. I'm not sure, but they call it easy water.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine even beyond a product, like to be able to create structured water, is there a simple way besides, obviously, I think going out into the sun is essential. Grounding yourself is essential to generate it within your own body. But is there a way to create structured water simply in the home for people?
We're working on that.
Yeah.
We're working on it. We're still not sure exactly. One possibility is through electrical current, because it's easy to put negative charge into the water. But we're still not sure.
I would imagine if you could take a glass of water outside and maybe set it on the ground.
It used to be done, still is in some of the Ayurvedic or Indian cultures. There's a woman working in my lab who is from India, and she said her grandfather used to put out bottles of water, colored. Each one is a different color, and depending on what illness you might have, drink the yellow one. So needs to be tested, But there's a lot of wisdom from the Ayurvedic culture.
Yes. Okay. So how can people learn more about the work that you're doing?
The fourth phase of water, the book is very popular, well reviewed. New book, I happen to have a copy here. It's not officially out yet, but this is a copy from the printer. Publication date is September 16th, but anybody can pre-order a copy if they want.
And the book's title?
The book is called Charged, The Unexpected Role of Electricity in the Workings of Nature.
And what is this unique thread that this is pulling at, this particular book?
A lot of us see phenomena around us all the time. We think we understand them, but we really don't understand them because there are a lot of facts that don't agree with the theory. And we're talking about things we experience every day, ranging from weather to gravitation, to how birds fly, to how planes fly, to how sailboats can go into the wind, directly into the wind, which doesn't make sense because the wind is blowing in the opposite direction, but there's got to be a way. And we're talking about, especially about ice boats, which can go essentially directly into the wind. What turns the earth every 24 hours? What's responsible for a wind gust? How do we understand weather from first principles? All of these are treated in this book. So I've been working on this book for some time, and part of the beauty of the book is the artwork of my son, Ethan. A lot of it is quirky. Most of it is illustrative. It's a major feature of the book. There are more than 200 color illustrations. So the book is reader friendly. You don't need to have a PhD in physics to understand it. And I'm excited about it. We got about 24 pre-reviews from people who read an early version, and they're really flattering. So I'm hoping that this book awakens some fresh ideas on how things work around us. How, it's something as simple as how planes fly. You'd be surprised. There was an article in Scientific American, not to belabor this, Scientific American, written by two guys who are considered to be the experts in flight dynamics. The title is something like How Planes Fly, and the subtitle is, surprise, despite years of study, we still don't understand how planes fly. It's true.
Yeah.
I try to provide an explanation here. And all of these explanations have something or other to do with electrical charge.
And if anyone wants to support, like financially donate to and support the work that you're doing, how can they do that?
Just email me. We would be thrilled. It's when you do work that runs against the mainstream, it's really hard to get money. And we're working on a pretty flimsy budget right now. If anybody is interested or excited by some of these ideas, please contact me. I can give you, email is ghp@uw.edu.
Yes, and they can find you at the University of Washington's
The University
website.
of Washington. Email is all over the place, so there's no secret.
Awesome. Dr. Pollack, I really, really appreciate you taking this time to sit and have this talk with me.
It's been my great pleasure. Really interesting questions that you ask. So much fun.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I would love your help. Comment and let me know what we should explore next. Don't forget, the Design Lab bonus session is linked below. Subscribe if you want more, and I'll see you in the next one.